Hi everyone, here's what's bothering me today. Again, we're talking a bit more about more modern day indigenous discrimination, racism, and a form of genocide. So we talked about pre-Confederation, post-Confederation up until the closing of the last residential school. There's a bit of a crossover here where now we're going to talk a lot about the injustices faced by Indigenous women and the Indigenous community still to this day. So, for starters, another form of genocide that we practiced against the natives was not just the residential school system, but also, as I touched on, by taking children from their families in the 60s scoop and putting them into foster care and adoption. This leads us to the controversial birth alert system that's happening on the West Coast in a lot of cases, and also Alberta is where many people have come forward claiming that this is a thing, where protective services and police and other institutions are using birth alerts to try and determine at-risk babies from Indigenous communities and removing them from their parents. And in some cases, they are also, when they're not taking the kids, what they're doing is they're forcing the mothers to sign sterilization papers, consenting to sterilization before they're allowed to see their baby. And yeah, this brings us to the terrifying history of compulsory sterilization in Canada, predominantly targeted at Native women, because Natives tended to have a non-typical Anglo-Saxon view of a family. You know, in white Western worlds like Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, we imagine this idea of the nuclear family as mom, dad, two kids, and some kind of pet, usually a dog, right? That's the dream. A lot of natives had the more it takes a village to raise a child approach. So there were lots more children, and with bigger family groups and bigger community groups, there was all this support that the biological parents could rely on to help support, raise, educate, love, and nurture their children. This didn't sit well with the fine people of Canada, and so what was really troublingly called family planning was an attempt at limiting the number of Indigenous births. Now, the people who initially went into this probably didn't go in with the intention of, oh, we got to get rid of the natives. You know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So they're thinking, oh, you know, we've been encouraged by governments and our agencies and universities and whoever to say, oh, you know what, you should actually, are you ready for a child? Maybe not. Oh, you know, your situation. It's it's a little sinister, but not outright evil in the sense of these people were deliberately trying to do it. They were trying to it was from the perspective of trying to lessen the burden and not having so many mouths to feed. But at the end of the day, this is still a sinister form of genocide where we're coercing and really trying to convince Indigenous women to either give up their own children or forcibly sterilize them so that they can see their children again after we've held them hostage for God knows how long. Now, because there isn't a lot of data or numbers on this, the only number I could find was that at least 1,200 Indigenous women have been sterilized in the period between 1970 and 1975. In terms of modern day numbers, we're not collecting data on it, so we don't know. But in just 5 years, that many women, that's a problem. Extrapolate that to Canada at large. It's a problem. And this brings us to, again, further plight suffered by Indigenous women in Canada because, well, there was this really harrowing story, I think 2 years ago maybe, it's this video. I've linked it in the description, and it's this really horrifying video of this Native woman who's cradling her newborn child in a Winnipeg hospital, and Child Protection Services or Child Foster Services show up with police and take the child from this mother, this newborn baby. And this is not an all too uncommon thing, thanks to the birth alerts and just general coercion of trying to tell women, oh, sorry, you're not in a great place or position or with a proper family support structure, so you should give up this child. And then that child goes into a foster system where the people who participate in that system get money and assistance from usually the province or the feds or both. But the woman who's given birth to that child doesn't get the same treatment. So, beyond the forced sterilization of Indigenous women in Canada, this also logically brings us to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis that has been facing Canada for a long time now. The final report did recently come out. The whole process was fraught with problems. Thankfully, we at least started it, but oh God, it just really shows us that we have a lot of work to do as a nation. Thousands of women murdered and killed. And beyond that, the numbers are really frightening. According to the April 22nd, 2016 background of the inquiry, between the years of 1980 and 2012, Indigenous women and girls represented 16% of all female homicides in Canada, while constituting only 4% of the female population in Canada. And then a 2011 Statistics Canada report estimated that between 1997 and 2000, the rate of homicides for Aboriginal women and girls was almost 7 times higher than that for other females. It's a problem. Because here in Canada, we are very racist towards the Natives and other minority groups here in Canada. To the point that now I also need to talk about other problems with how we treat Natives in the modern day. Very recently, there was a chief. I can't remember his name, but he was just out, minding his own business, and he was pulled over for an expired license sticker by several RCMP officers who forcibly threw him to the ground despite him not really resisting and proceeded to beat him up. There's also the really controversial Colton Boushie case, where he and some friends were trespassing on a rural property in Big R, Saskatchewan. And ultimately, Colton Boushie was shot and killed. And an all-white jury acquitted the man of all charges, including manslaughter. That's a very testy subject. I think I'm going to save that for its own video at some point in the future. I'm just trying to show my fellow Canadians and those who think Canada is this peaceful, wonderful, nice, progressive nation that we still have some very serious problems that happen to the present day. Another problem dealing with Natives and Saskatchewan are the horrifying Starlight tours. Now, for those of you who don't know, these Starlight tours were these really horrifically named instances where again, I guess for legal purposes, I have to say allegedly, Saskatchewan police officers in Saskatoon, Saskatoon police officers would find and take drunk Natives in the middle of the winter and suggest that they take them on a Starlight tour, and they'd drive them out in the cold prairie winter night usually without any proper protective clothing, far away from their homes or cars or loved ones or anything like that. They'd drive them out into the middle of nowhere and dump them out for them to hopefully find their way home. The only reason we know about these Starlight tours is that one of the alleged victims who came forward with this story survived. several other dead natives were not so lucky to survive a Starlight tour in the hands of the Saskatoon police. These happened in the early 2000s. You know, when people like me were in high school. Imagine being a teenager and brought out into the middle of the countryside while you're drunk and abandoned there by a member of an organization that is ostensibly supposed to help you and protect you in times of distress. So when I hear people say that we here in Canada are not as bad as the United States, I get very angry and bothered because I know it's not true. Just with all the stories that I've been trying to bring to light over the course of this week, this should really put to death the notion that we are not racist against our Indigenous population, against our Black population, against our minority and immigrant population, which I think I'm going to have to get to tomorrow in a separate video. These stories are harrowing, and I'm going to end as well by foreshadowing another video, because we also have a problem with police violence against racialized minorities who have mental health issues. And most recently, and largely unfortunately overshadowed by the George Floyd protests, we had our own instance of several natives in the span of a few days being killed accidentally by police. Regis Korchinski-Paquette is a Black and Indigenous woman who fell from her balcony in Toronto during a wellness check. And seemingly almost no time later, we heard of this poor Native woman in New Brunswick who was killed by police during a wellness check. We absolutely have a problem with police violence, which I'm going to get to in a future video this week. But the idea that a lot of our injustices rendered against Indigenous people in the past is absolutely not true. Hell, look at the Wet'suwet'en protests and pipeline protests that have been happening. This is Canada's own version of Standing Rock, and yet we're not really talking about it. The Oka crisis in the 90s that I remember because my dad was actually stuck there during that time. That's another video for another time to tell that story. But the Oka crisis, or the Kanesatake resistance, was something that happened in the 90s, and I think it was like 78 days. And it got the Canadian military involved in this huge standoff because the Mohawk living there had the audacity to fight back against a golf course that was going to be built over a sacred burial ground. If someone said, we want to bury an old cemetery full of, historic white people and their family members and their mausoleums, we want to pave over that to build a mall or to build a golf course, there would be riots in the street. The natives had the audacity to stand up for their ancestors and the respect for their dead, and they got faced with the Canadian Army, as well as, of course, violence and frothing anger from white Canadians. We have problems in this country, and we need to do a better job of teaching people about our own history. And the fact that so many Canadians remain ignorant of all this is what's bothering me today.